Module aliasing. So before diving deep to that concept of module aliasing, let's look at the problem that module aliasing would solve. So we see here three imports, one from the nestjs project, and two that we have made in the departments folder within the departments, where it is pointing to the interface and at the same time as well the entity. This is what we depend on in order for it to point towards the property, the type. So the problem here, there's no problem with it. For example, you say like to point towards a project, you say point dot 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 and then the departments, for example, right? However, what if we have another deeper core import problem, like for example, you want to point towards one that is really somewhere far away. Let's just go outside, really a bit outside. For example, you want to have a common folder, and within that common, there is a source, and then within that source, you have, for example, the enums. And within that enums, you want to have a days. Now, you could see how crazy it could go. So, maybe there's no problem with you where you could just put it that, or you know where the folders are. But however, what if another person comes in and wants to import some projects, right? So, for example, now he doesn't know those two imports. Now, what he has to do is either depend on the TypeScript, where the TypeScript will make a mistake on instead of pointing towards dot dot, it will say use source, and some compilers like webpack don't like the source folder, or any testing they don't like the source. They prefer you to point the folder specifically. And so, for example, now they're pointing at normal, there's no issues. However, when it's building, there is an issue. So, the issue being is for them to fix it, they need to know where the folder is. For example, now there's that departments folder, right? So they have to specifically say, okay, let's go check this. All right, I found it. Now next is here source. Okay, I have to do that. All right, I found it. Now the another that is okay for two times doing it, but however, like the issue that I showed case, like for example, the import of this one that would go deep into a different place, and they have to search through there and here and there. That will cause like one, they will just trust maybe the TypeScript, or two, they have to go through each folder, and that for it's time consuming. That's where module aliasing comes in. So what is module aliasing? So the best case scenario for us for to make it much more better is, for example, you don't have to go deep, but since you specifically have folders that have been mentioned, right? For example, one is subject departments. Every single one has a specific unique folder. So the folders should recognize where it is. So you could just mention, for example, here, departments, and now it will know which folder you're pointing at. Similar to how we point towards the packages, where you just say add nestjs GraphQL, and it will go through the node modules and will find that folder. Instead of you doing source and node modules, it will instantly know where it is. So how can we do that? Like instead of going deep into the folders, we could just do departments folder and it will instantly recognize it. That's where module aliasing comes in. So in order to have module aliasing, either you use a build tool that is Webpack or Bubble. Usually web frameworks or frameworks, front-end frameworks or back-end frameworks are wrapped around with a build tool like Webpack or the other one, Bubble. Yeah. So for example, Next.js, you could use Bubble for module aliasing, and for Nest.js, in the case of this backend framework, it uses Webpack as it wraps around under the hood, uses Webpack. So if you're using pure Node.js, it sucks to be you and come join our framework cult. You have to install some webpack configuration, but that's okay. You could just configure it and it will be it's all right. You could check it out on the website of webpack. So in the root folder, we have a webpack folder, and in that webpack folder, forget the other configurations. They are service. Doesn't it didn't mean for the module releasing, but then there is a property, and you could as well check in the webpack called resolve. This resolves some parts of the folders. It's depending on the folders. So now in the part of we have alias. So in this part, the alias, what I pointed, what I point towards is the folders that I want to have as like instead of mentioning dot dot and those stuff, I'm mentioning, for example, if users mentions users, point towards this folder. If someone mentions auth, mention this folder. And these folders are just my modules for the project. So these are maybe depending on each other. So I don't have to specify the dot dot and have the other ones that they're like it is much more easier to point towards a folder. So whatever you call it, you could mention, for example, some people prefer, for example, um, at right? They prefer using it, or you could use anything that you want, for example, hash, whatever. But I'm using here. People say it's best practices, and I think for me it's much more preferable to read. So I just point towards that name of that folder. Users, for example, it will point to that, and everything else. Now, one issue being is that's so far so good for JavaScript projects. However, for the TypeScript, the issue being is you could see as well here, like if I point towards it, it won't recognize it. And the issue being is TypeScript doesn't know where that is. It just points to a source and departments and those stuff. So we have to configure that TypeScript build to it as well. In one thing is another thing is like you have to mention as well, like if your project is using TypeScript, you have to mention here the TS loader, which point towards the TypeScript build tool, which is in the folder of this.config build.json. So it will point towards that one and it will build the project according to the TypeScript folder. So in order to configure the TypeScript with the webpack, so we just go ts-config build ts-config JSON, and that one basically what you have to do is specify a path variable. So here is just a path property and mention path. Before that, it doesn't have anything previously, like you could just remove it and it looks the same as before, how as a default for nestjs. And you could just specify an object that has several points, several modules that is aliasing towards to. So here I mentioned that I'm pointing towards users, all subject, utility, foreign, departments, and coach. Now, it still didn't recognize it. You could see it as well, right? It didn't recognize it. And the issue is now, like, this is good and all for folders that have an index. Like for example, this subject, for example, if it has an index folder and you pointing towards the folders like index.ts, each folder has an index.js and they are exporting to every single one, then it works. It works fine. However, if you put folders like myself doesn't have any index for each folder, like for example, the department doesn't have an index that will export every single classes and the things that we need, you have to mention, for example, you have to mention here for the departments, for example, we mention star. So anything that is within that star point towards this folder. So now when we, for example, go towards our previous index project, which is in types, so when we point towards that one, for example, just hover on it and you could see, voila, it pointed towards that department's slash types. Now, for the case of the department, you could do that too. So you could just hover on it and you could see there is department entity. You could see that it is looks much more readable. In my case, it looks much more readable. It looks much more easy to understand, and you don't have to go through every place that you don't have to check every folder. So that's about module listing. Yeah, thank you very much. Have a good day.